They laughed at her in the street, mocked her for being too fat for marriage. She stood alone, clutching her shawl as cruel voices tore at her dignity. But in the shadows, a lonely rancher watched, silent, steady, and in that moment, her story was only beginning. From their doorways in the dwindling light. Dust rose in the air, glowing gold beneath the last flare of sunset, before drifting into the chill of coming night. When the wagon came to a halt in front of the livery, Margaret gripped the frame with both hands before stepping down. Her gray dress, once neat, had faded with travel and wear, and her shawl frayed like a banner of the long road behind her. She adjusted the braid that bound her dark hair tight against her scalp, as if holding her together could hold the world from falling apart. The driver flicked the reins, eager to be on his way, and the wagon rattled toward the outskirts, leaving her planted in the center of the town's gaze. It did not take long for the whispers to begin. A woman sweeping her porch lowered her broom, smirking at her neighbor. A boy of no more than 12 nudged his friend and snickered, their laughter cutting sharper than the cool air. Men leaning against the saloon rail let their eyes travel her figure, then turned away with crude chuckles. She felt each look like a stone thrown against her chest. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter, though no cloth could shield her from the sting of their judgment. She had traveled so far with a promise, with a letter folded close to her heart, believing she would step into a new life, a marriage that might lift her from the ashes of her widowhood. But the street felt more like a gallows than a path to dignity. A figure detached from the crowd at the general store, a stocky man with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel. "Ain't you the one sent for James Whitlock's bride?" His tone bore no welcome, only doubt. Her throat tightened. "Yes," she said softly, almost to herself. The man barked a laugh and called over his shoulder. "She's here, all right." Another figure appeared, lean, with Whitlock features she recognized from the brief letter, perhaps a brother or cousin. He looked her up and down, his lip curling as if her very presence insulted him. "No," he said flatly. "James ain't here. He ain't comin'. He changed his mind." Her voice trembled. "But he wrote," he said. The man cut her off, his words louder for all to hear. "He don't want a wife like you. You're too fat for marriage, woman. Best take your wagon back where you came from." Laughter rolled through the street like dry thunder. The porch women shook their heads, whispering to one another. A group of young men outside the saloon hooted, one miming the swell of hips with vulgar gesture. Margaret stood frozen, her shawl clenched tight, humiliation scalding her cheeks. She tried to step toward the man, to plead for explanation, but he had already turned his back, spitting into the dust as if to seal his verdict. One by one, doors shut against her. Lanterns glowed in windows, but no hand reached out to welcome her, no kind voice rose to soften the sting. She stood stranded in the widening dusk, the sky dimming to violet above the rooftops. For the first time since she buried her first husband, she felt smaller than the world could hold, as though she might vanish into the dirt. Hooves sounded on the far end of the street, slow and steady. A horse came forward, its rider tall in the saddle, hat brim pulled low. He did not speak as he drew near, and yet the hush of his presence bent the mood of the crowd. Daniel Carter was a man most in town avoided, solitary, scarred by years of work and silence, the kind who carried his own ghosts without leaning on another soul. He reined in near where she stood, his eyes shadowed but steady upon her. Margaret did not know him, not yet, but something in the way he sat his horse, calm, rooted, as though no storm could uproot him, steadied her breath. For a long moment, neither spoke. The townsfolk shuffled, uneasy, their cruel laughter faltering under the weight of his silence. Daniel's weathered face revealed little, but his gaze held something she had not seen all day, recognition. Not of beauty, nor of failure, but of the quiet suffering that marked one abandoned. He had known such a weight before, the lines at his brow carried its memory. Margaret dropped her eyes, ashamed of the tears threatening to fall. She clutched her shawl as though it were armor, though it was threadbare and thin. She wondered if he, too, would turn away, or worse, add his voice to the jeering chorus. But Daniel only looked once at the faces gathered, then back to her. His hand shifted lightly on the reins. His silence was not indifference, it was something else, something that pressed against the cold laughter around them and left it hollow. The crowd began to scatter, muttering, returning to their doorways and porches. The boys drifted off toward the alley, the broom resumed its sweep, the saloon's piano rose again. Margaret remained rooted, alone in the street, yet not as utterly alone as she had been a moment before. The horse stamped, tossing its mane. Daniel tipped his hat slightly, a gesture small but full of weight, and guided the animal past her. He did not speak, not yet. But his quiet eyes lingered on her long enough for her to feel it deep within, the unspoken truth that even those mocked and discarded still deserved a place to belong. As the night fell and the lantern swayed against the wind, Margaret stood with the echo of laughter still burning her ears, but also with the first fragile spark of something else. Not hope, not yet, but the faintest possibility that her story was not yet finished, and that one man's silence might carry more kindness than 100 empty words. The prairie stretched wide and lonesome beyond the town, the road winding into the hills where shadows lengthened and the air grew colder. Daniel rode ahead, his horse steady, while Margaret followed on foot until he slowed and wordlessly reached out a hand. She hesitated only a moment before he lifted her up behind him. The shawl clutched to her chest fluttered in the wind, and she lowered her eyes so he would not see the shame still burning there. The rhythm of the horse beneath them was the only sound for miles, steady as a heartbeat against the silence of the plains. When they reached his homestead, the cabin stood plain but upright, built of rough-hewn logs silvered by weather. Smoke trailed faint from the chimney, carrying the scent of cedar and ash. He swung down, then held the reins loosely as she climbed from the saddle, her feet sinking into the dirt of ground that bore no welcome sign, yet no rejection either. Inside, the room was small and spare. A single rocking chair rested near the fire, worn smooth by years of use. Old rifles hung on the wall above a shelf of tools, each carefully kept. Against the far wall lay a bed, a quilt folded neatly at its end, the corners tucked as if someone had once taken pride in such care. But there were no flowers, no soft touches of a woman's hand, only absence, felt heavy as the silence between them. Margaret stood near the door, hands clasped before her. Daniel busied himself with the fire, adding a log until it caught and brightened the room. He gestured for her to sit, and she obeyed, lowering herself stiffly onto the chair opposite the hearth. The flames flickered across her face, drawing out the hollows of weariness in her cheeks, the braid pulling tight against her scalp. She smoothed her dress over her lap, feeling the eyes of memory more than the man across the room. Supper was plain, bread, a pot of beans, and what little jerky he had set aside. She ate carefully, each bite small, aware of how her body had been judged in town. The shame clung to her throat, choking down the food as though each mouthful marked her unworthy. Daniel noticed, though he said nothing. He filled a chipped tin cup and set it before her, the steam of coffee curling upward. His hand lingered only long enough to be seen before he returned to his own seat. Margaret wrapped her fingers around the cup, grateful for its warmth. She risked a glance at him, the lines etched deep around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the quiet strength in shoulders bowed not from weakness but from years of carrying burdens unseen. He did not press her with questions. His silence was not unkind. It was the silence of one who had lost and learned the futility of filling grief with words. Later, when the fire sank low and the cabin grew dim, Daniel spread a quilt across the bed and nodded for her to take it. She obeyed, though her heart thudded as she lay beneath its weight, turned toward the wall. The laughter of the townsfolk returned to her ears, cruel and cutting, their voices rising like a storm she could not outrun. Tears slipped across her face, soaking into the pillow. She pressed her braid against her cheek, as if its tightness might hold her together through the unraveling ache. Daniel sat in the rocker by the fire, its slow creak steady against the wind outside. He heard her quiet weeping, though he gave no sign. His gaze rested on the flames, but his mind wandered elsewhere, to a fevered bed where a woman once gasped for breath, to a small cedar cross weathering on the hill beyond the pasture. He felt the old hollowness stir, the ache of absence that time had dulled but never silenced. He did not move to her side, did not intrude, for he knew grief's solitude too well. The night stretched on in that shared silence, broken only by the crack of settling wood in the hearth. Margaret wept softly until exhaustion overcame her, the quilt cocooning her in warmth she had not expected. Daniel sat long after, watching embers glow and fade, his hand resting on the arm of the chair where the grain of the wood bore grooves from years of rocking. In that room, shadows of the past lingered heavy, each carrying their own. Neither spoke of loss, nor of the cruelty of the world outside. But in the stillness, their griefs brushed against each other, two souls bound not by words but by wounds. She dreamed of laughter turned to ash, he of fever and cedar graves, yet both woke with the faint sense that silence, when shared, no longer cut as deep. By dawn, the storm within them had not lifted, but it had shifted. Margaret rose fragile yet upright, her braid loosened, her eyes rimmed red but clear. Daniel, stoic as ever, tended the fire without remark. Yet when he set the tin cup before her again, filled with fresh coffee, it was not only habit, it was a quiet act of protection, as sure and steady as the walls around them. The wounds of the past lingered, but now, in another's silence, each heard an echo that was not their own. And in that echo lay the faintest beginning of understanding. The first whisper of the storm came at dusk, a breath of wind that set the cottonwoods shivering. By nightfall it had grown into a howl across the plains, tearing through the grasslands like a restless spirit. Rain hammered the roof in relentless sheets, seeping through the smallest cracks, while the wind rattled the shutters as if demanding entry. The cabin shuddered beneath its force, but Daniel tended the fire with calm hands, feeding the flames until their glow fought back the storm's shadow. Margaret sat near the hearth, shawl wrapped tight, her braid damp where a drop of rain had slipped through the chinks. She had grown accustomed to silence between them, but tonight it pressed heavier, each gust outside echoing the fear that lay unspoken in her chest. The prairie was wide and merciless, storms like this reminded her how small a soul could feel beneath heaven's weight. A knock broke through the roar of rain. It was not sharp, but steady, 3 firm raps on the door. Margaret's head lifted, eyes wide. Daniel rose without hesitation, his shadow tall against the firelight as he crossed the room. When the door swung open, rain and wind burst inward, revealing a man on the threshold, water streaming from his hair and clothes. His face was strong, lined by travel and hunger, his dark eyes catching the firelight. He spoke in quiet English, accented but clear. Shelter. Margaret's breath caught. She had heard the town stories, all thick with fear, raids on cattle, families robbed in the night. Her hand tightened on the edge of her shawl. But Daniel did not flinch. He stepped aside, the gesture simple, and motioned him in. The stranger entered, bringing with him the scent of rain-soaked earth. He stood tall yet weary, his shoulders slumping as though the storm itself pressed him down. Water pooled at his feet. Daniel closed the door, shutting out the gale, and pointed toward the fire. Warm yourself. Margaret stared, uncertain. Her heart thudded as she saw Daniel move toward the cupboard, pulling bread from the tin. He set it on the table as if this were any other guest, not the figure her mind had been taught to fear. The stranger lowered himself to the hearth, stretching his hands toward the flames. Steam rose from his sleeves as the heat began to draw the wet from his clothes. His eyes closed for a moment, as though the fire's warmth were a balm long denied. When he opened them again, they rested not on Daniel, but on Margaret. His gaze was steady, unreadable, and she felt her pulse quicken. Daniel's voice was quiet, the same tone he had used with her since she'd arrived. You've walked far. The man nodded once. Far. He paused, his English halting. Our people, hunger. Winter comes. Many walk. He did not say more. He did not beg. He simply sat, firelight flickering across his strong features. Margaret hesitated, torn between the echoes of town gossip and the sight before her. He was not the monster painted in their words, only a man worn by road and weather. Still, her hands trembled as she rose, moving toward the stove. She poured water into the pot, spooned the last of the grounds, and set it to boil. The hiss of steam joined the storm outside. When she set the cup before him, he looked at her, really looked. Then he touched the tin gently, bowing his head, and spoke words she did not understand. The sound was soft, flowing, carrying gratitude even she could feel. Margaret blinked, startled. Her fingers fumbled at her shawl. No one had spoken to her with such reverence in months, certainly not in that town. Something in her chest loosened, just a fraction, though she fought to keep her guard. Daniel watched, his face unreadable, yet there was a stillness about him that told her this was not the first time he had stood between worlds. His respect was not born of novelty, but of quiet knowing. He passed bread to the stranger without fuss, as though feeding the hungry were simply what was due. The storm raged on, battering the roof, tearing at the shutters. Inside, the fire burned steady, casting its glow on three souls who would not have chosen each other, yet who now shared one roof. Margaret sat back down, her shawl slipping loose, eyes fixed on the flames. She still felt fear, yes, the old warnings whispering in her ear. But beneath it stirred something else, something unfamiliar, almost shameful in its relief. This man, for all his strangeness, had thanked her more sincerely than any soul in town. As the hours passed, the storm became a wall of sound, rain slashing at the earth, wind keening like voices of the lost. Yet within the cabin, there was only the crackle of fire, the steady breathing of the horse in the lean-to, and the quiet presence of three who, for one night, belonged nowhere but here. When at last she lifted her eyes, she found Daniel watching the fire, his profile lit in amber light. His silence was steady, neither fearful nor proud. He was simply a bridge, built not of words but of action, sheltering those who came. Margaret turned back to the flames, her hands still trembling slightly around the shawl. But inside her, something had shifted. Hospitality, she realized, was not weakness. It was strength. And sometimes, in the teeth of a storm, unity was born not of blood or promise, but of bread shared and silence kept. The storm did not break the next day, nor the day after. Rain swept across the plains in unending sheets, drumming on the roof until the sound wove itself into every thought. The wind whistled through the chinks of the cabin walls, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and cedar smoke. Days blurred into one another, measured only by the tending of the fire, the splitting of wood, the mending of small things. Three souls bound by necessity beneath one low roof. Margaret moved quietly about the cabin, shawl trailing at her shoulders. She gathered what garments she could find in a chest near the bed, shirts worn soft with age, socks needing stitches, and set to work with needle and thread. Each careful motion gave her something she had not felt in too long, purpose. Her fingers remembered the rhythm of usefulness, and though her stitches were uneven, they held. She did not speak of it, but when she glanced up and saw Daniel's eyes flick briefly toward her work, then return to the logs he was splitting, she felt a warmth that lingered long after the fire's glow faded. The stranger, too, sat quietly, watching. His gaze unsettled her at first, dark and unreadable, but he never intruded. When she passed him bread or coffee, he accepted with a nod, his hand steady, his gratitude spoken without flourish. He listened to the storm as though it carried messages she could not hear. Sometimes she caught him studying her, and though she stiffened, she began to understand it was not mockery in his look, but recognition, perhaps of someone else who had been cast aside. Daniel worked with the constancy of stone. He split wood in the rain, his shirt clinging to the scars and sinew of his shoulders, his movements deliberate. Margaret, peering through the window, noticed how the axe rose and fell without waste, as though each swing measured not just strength but discipline. When he came inside, water dripping from his hat brim, he never complained of the storm. He shook off the wet, set the wood by the fire, and returned to silence. Yet she caught the way his gaze lingered on her once, her braid loosening, strands of hair curling damp along her temple, the shawl slipping unnoticed from her shoulders. He said nothing, but the weight of his seeing lingered. By the third night, the storm pressed hard enough to shake the walls. The three of them sat near the fire, its glow fragile against the black roar outside. Margaret's needle slowed, her hands trembling from weariness. Daniel sat in his chair, sharpening a blade with measured strokes, while the stranger stared into the flames, lips moving with words unspoken. The knock came sudden, fierce, fists against the wood drowned only partly by the storm. Daniel rose at once. Margaret's breath caught, and even the stranger tensed. When Daniel opened the door, rain swept in, torches flaring in the night beyond. 3 townsmen stood there, faces shadowed, voices sharp. "We heard you're keepin' a thief," one shouted over the rain. "That savage's been stealing from camps. We won't have him hid under your roof." Their eyes slid to Margaret, and cruel grins spread across their faces. "And look at this. You've gone and taken yourself a burden wife too, Daniel. Didn't think you were the type to pick what nobody else wanted." Laughter rose, ugly and hollow, carried on the storm's breath. Margaret felt heat rush to her cheeks, her shawl clutched tight as if it might shield her from their scorn. The old humiliation roared back, sharper now for being spoken at her own doorstep. Daniel stepped into the doorway, rifle in hand. He did not raise it, only held it steady, the barrel catching torchlight. His voice cut through the storm, quiet yet immovable. "She belongs here." The word struck heavier than any bullet. The men shifted, laughter faltering. They stared at him, at the set of his shoulders, at the calm certainty in his eyes. The storm raged behind them, but no man stepped forward. One spat into the mud, muttered a curse, and the torches turned away, their glow shrinking into the night. Daniel closed the door, set the rifle against the wall, and returned to his chair as though nothing had passed. But Margaret stood trembling, the shawl loose in her hands. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from something deeper, a flame lit within her that she scarcely recognized. No one had ever spoken so plainly, so firmly, to claim her as worth defending. She sank onto the bench, her hands pressed against her lap, trying to steady the shaking. The stranger's eyes met hers across the fire, and for the first time, she did not look away. He inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a truth that needed no words. Margaret breathed slowly, letting the storm's howl fade to the edges of her mind. Daniel had not said more than 4 words, yet they carried the weight of years, of loss, of conviction. She felt the ember of worth spark in her chest, fragile but glowing. For once, she was not discarded. For once, she belonged. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a deeper silence had settled, one not born of emptiness, but of quiet protection. The storm broke with the pale light of dawn, leaving the world washed and quiet. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, of something freshly born after days of fury. Mist rose from the sodden grass, curling like smoke across the pasture. Margaret stepped outside, the hem of her dress heavy with damp from the chores she had taken on that morning. Her braid had loosened entirely in the night, strands falling free around her face. She lifted her eyes to the horizon where clouds drifted apart, letting shafts of gold pour across the land. Daniel stood in the corral, reins in hand, his hat pushed back on his head. He leaned against the fence rail, his gaze following her without haste. There was no judgment in his eyes, no mockery, only something quiet and unspoken, as if he were seeing not just the woman before him but the strength hidden beneath the shawl and shame she carried. Margaret felt the weight of his looking and turned her face slightly, but not in embarrassment. It was something else, something she was still learning to name. When they sat down to breakfast, the room carried a different stillness. The fire snapped gently in the hearth, smoke drifting upward through the chimney. Margaret dared more than she had before, she filled her plate, she ate without forcing each bite small, she let her hunger show. For the first time, she did not bow her head in apology. Daniel said nothing, but he did not look away either. He ate in his steady manner, yet his eyes met hers once, and the silence between them carried no shame. The stranger prepared to leave not long after, his coat dried, his strength somewhat returned. He had spoken little during his stay, but as he stood in the doorway, he reached into his pack and withdrew a small object, carved from cedar. It was a token, shaped like a feather, edges smoothed by patient hands. He placed it on the table with a nod, the firelight catching its grain. No words were needed, gratitude was carved into the gift itself. Margaret touched it gently, her fingers tracing the grooves. She did not understand his language, not fully, but she understood this: he left behind more than wood. He left the proof that bridges could be mended where others saw only division. When the door closed behind him, the cabin felt emptier for a moment. His absence was a reminder that storms, however binding, must pass. Margaret stood at the window, watching him disappear across the plains until rain-softened ground swallowed his figure. She held the carved token close, her thumb running over its ridges, and thought of how little she truly knew of the world. The cruelty of the town had made her shrink, but here, she had glimpsed something larger than scorn. That night, the fire burned low, casting long shadows along the walls. Daniel sat in his rocker, the blade he had sharpened set aside. Margaret sat opposite, her shawl folded neatly for once, her hands resting on her lap. The silence pressed, but it was no longer unbearable. She felt words stirring within her, fragile but insistent, demanding release. They laughed, she said quietly, eyes fixed on the flames. Her voice trembled, but she forced it steady. They said no man would want me. Not after I lost the one I had. They said I was too much, too fat, too plain, too broken. They said no house could carry me without crumbling. She swallowed, the memory raw. And I believed them. Daniel did not move for a long moment. The fire crackled, the storm's memory still whispering in the beams above. Then, finally, his voice came, low, deliberate, carrying weight. A house needs more than walls. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the scars along his hands, the lines at his eyes. It needs someone who'll stay. The words fell between them, heavier than any vow, truer than any denial she had ever heard. Margaret's breath caught, her hands tightening in her lap. She lifted her gaze at last, meeting his. In his face she did not see pity, nor desire, but something steadier, endurance, recognition, the quiet confession of a man who had lived too long in emptiness. Her hand shifted, uncertain, until her fingers brushed against the coffee tin resting between them on the table. His hand moved almost at the same time, rough knuckles grazing hers. The touch was small, trembling, fleeting, but it carried more weight than the cruel voices of a dozen towns, more than any ceremony she had once dreamed of. It was the first true acknowledgement that she was not merely tolerated, but chosen, in the quiet way that mattered most. The fire burned low, their hands still near, neither pulling away. Margaret felt warmth rise in her chest, shy but steady, a glimmer of something she had thought lost forever. Daniel's eyes held hers for a breath, then returned to the flames, yet the connection remained, stronger for its silence. Outside, the land steamed in the moonlight, the storm's fury replaced by stillness. Inside, for the first time, Margaret felt something stirring that no cruelty could extinguish. It was not yet love, not fully, but it was its beginning, born not in desire but in endurance, in the quiet recognition of two souls who had both learned to stay when the world had left them behind. The prairie carried word faster than the wind. It did not take long before whispers spread from porch to porch, saloon to livery, that Daniel Carter had given shelter to a stranger from the hills, and worse, that he had taken in a woman the town had scorned. By the week's end, shadows rode out from town, carrying torches that bobbed against the dusk like fireflies twisted to menace. The sound of hooves grew louder, echoing across the open land until it reached the small cabin that stood alone against the horizon. Margaret felt it before she heard it, the old dread rising in her chest, tightening her shawl around her shoulders as though cloth could shield her from ridicule. She stood near the window, her breath shallow, while Daniel set his hand against the rifle leaning by the door. He did not raise it, did not even shift his stance. He simply rested his palm against the stock, a quiet readiness. The men drew up before the cabin, their torches flaring against the dark. Faces glared from beneath wide-brimmed hats, voices rang harsh over the distance. "We know you kept him here, Carter. That savage walked free under your roof." Another voice cut through, sharp with scorn. "And now this? You've taken yourself a burden wife. Too fat, too slow, too much for any man with sense. What kind of home you running out here?" Laughter followed, cruel and cutting, just as it had on that first night when Margaret had stepped into the dusty street. The sound pierced her ears, dragged her back into shame she thought she had begun to shed. Her hands trembled against her shawl, her heart pounding like hooves across her chest. She wanted to vanish into the walls, to fold into the quilt and disappear. But Daniel stepped forward into the doorway, the firelight at his back casting his frame into shadow. His hand still rested on the rifle, but he did not lift it. His voice came low and steady, louder than the jeers for its calm. "She belongs here." The words hung in the air heavier than the storm clouds that had only just broken. Silence rippled through the crowd, torches sputtering in the wind. A few shifted in their saddles, eyes falling, unable to meet the weight of his gaze. Daniel's shoulders were square, his presence unyielding, not born of anger but of certainty. He did not threaten. He did not beg. He simply claimed. Margaret's breath caught. Her chest rose, not in panic this time, but with a swell of dignity she had not felt in years. The words wrapped around her like armor, steadying the quiver in her bones. She stepped closer to the doorway, her head lifting, and for once she did not clutch the shawl to hide herself. She let it fall loose, her figure plain in the torchlight, unashamed. The men muttered among themselves, their laughter broken, scattered like ash in the wind. One spat into the dirt, another cursed, but none dared step forward against Daniel's quiet stand. At last, one by one, the torches turned away. Hooves beat back across the prairie until only darkness and silence remained. Daniel lowered his hand from the rifle and closed the door. The fire crackled in the hearth, the air thick with the scent of smoke and rain-washed earth. For a long moment, neither spoke. Margaret's eyes burned with tears, but not of humiliation. These were different, tears born of relief, of something long buried finally set free. Daniel moved to the stable and returned with the horse saddled, reins in hand. He gestured without words, as he so often did, and she understood. He lifted her gently onto the horse, the shawl wrapped snug about her shoulders. His hands lingered just long enough to steady her, then he swung up behind, his arm a steady wall at her side. They rode into the night, the prairie stretching endless beneath a sky washed clean of storm. The wind caught at her hair, loose now from its braid, strands whipping across her cheeks. She leaned into him, her tears carried away by the same wind that once brought only shame. Now it carried freedom. She closed her eyes, the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, the warmth of Daniel at her side, and knew with certainty what she had not dared to believe: her worth had never been measured by the curve of her body or the scorn of cruel voices. It was measured in her survival, in her refusal to vanish when the world tried to cast her aside. And now, it was measured in being chosen, truly chosen, not for beauty or for need, but for staying, for belonging. Daniel did not speak as they rode, but his silence carried more than words could hold. She felt it in the steadiness of his arm, in the way he guided the horse through the wet grass, in the certainty of his presence. He was no longer only the silent guardian of his own grief. He was her partner now, not by law or letter, but by the vow of action, of endurance, of quiet strength. The prairie lay wide before them, shimmering with the silver of moonlight. The world that had mocked her fell away behind, and ahead stretched only horizon, clean and unbroken. Margaret pressed her cheek to his shoulder, the damp of her tears mixing with the wind, and breathed deeply. Second chances, she realized, were the truest justice. And for the first time in years, she belonged.